Clifton Climate Action and the BCR Energy Group, and both really need support because they do valuable work, putting on great talks and providing local resource information, but they can't do it without some funding. So if you enjoyed tonight, if you find it useful, please do send over a donation to the paypal.me site up there. Okay, thanks very much. So the question we're going to discuss tonight, if I can get my screen to move on, is nuclear the answer? So we're going to discuss this over two nights, of course. The second one will be on Wednesday at the same time. And so when we look at, so the question, of course, why are we looking at nuclear? It's because we face a climate crisis. We've got to decarbonize our electricity generation. And many people consider nuclear to be the answer to this. And that's what we're going to look at. I'll give you a little spoiler now. I don't think that is the case, but that's what we will consider. And I suppose the point is, to answer that question, first of all, we all need to understand what nuclear is. And most of us don't. I have to say I didn't until I really started studying this. Most of us have grown up with plutonium, uranium, Sellafield, Magnox, whatever it is. And these terms we've washed over our heads for decades, but we don't really understand what they are. So this talk tonight, what I'm really going to do is talk you through the infrastructure, particularly the UK's infrastructure, and what nuclear power is. And then on Wednesday, we'll be looking much more at UK energy policy and Hinkley in particular, and where we go from here, and wrapping up that question: is it low carbon? Is nuclear affordable? Is it safe? And all the other things that we need to answer. So, okay, so this is particularly timely at the moment because our government certainly is committing itself again to more nuclear and expanding this. Sizewell, as we'll come on to discuss, is probably the next in line of our nuclear thermal plants. And it looks like at the moment, EDF are pressing to start construction on that at the end of this year. Bradwell is the Chinese-led thermal plant over in Essex, which again, we're just at the moment considering their design plans. Usually this takes a few years, but this was, if it gets the go-ahead, we'll be going ahead within the next couple of 2 or 3 years. Wilfer on the Isle of Anglesey, again, we'll come on and discuss that, but it's certainly in the offing. And interestingly, our government has just made a commitment and is putting out to tender the possibility of a nuclear fusion centre in the UK, a nuclear fusion development. So lots happening in the world of nuclear after quite a long period of relative silence. And I think it's worth looking, first of all, at just how dependent the UK is on nuclear. So you can see various pie charts here showing how our mix of electricity generation has changed since 2014. And of course, the real standouts here are the collapse in our coal from about 30% down to around 2%. And of course, the expansion of our renewables from about 19% to 37%. But what has stayed fairly consistent is our nuclear, which is around 20%. Interestingly, 2019, which is the last one we have figures for from the digest of UK energy statistics, shows that we're down to about 17%. And again, we'll go on and discuss that, but roughly consistent. And of course, that's not the pie chart isn't a set size. At the moment, over the last 10, 15 years, our electricity consumption in the UK has actually been going down. But the government certainly predicts that from about mid-2020s, it will start to go up. And partly that's demographics, partly it's as we start to decarbonize the other important vital sectors of our economy, particularly our heating and our transport. And it's whatever we do with those, it's likely to put more demand on our electricity generation. So we certainly do need to find more clean sources of renewable energy. Okay, so when it comes to nuclear, is it going to fit that bill? Is it going to meet that demand? And the questions that we have to ask, of course, are these really, except that I want you to expand this into a pentagon, because this is a very simplistic model, which actually even the government has sort of quietly dropped, but it's quite a useful tool for just thinking as we go through the lecture. First of all, we're looking for energy sources that are low in carbon. So so this top one here, we're looking for security of energy supply. We're looking for energy that we can rely on. And we're looking for, I can't see the last one, energy, how do I get rid of this? Oh. Sorry. The energy that's affordable for all of us. So for you, me, and for businesses in our economy. So those are the basics. That's the energy trilemma that the government has used as its framework for considering over many years now. But as I say, is now quietly dropped. And I think nuclear is one of the reasons it's dropped it, because it is such a simplistic tool. It doesn't really consider the safety elements, the issues about cyber hacking that we're becoming more used to. And so on. So there's much that isn't included there, but it's still something to keep in your mind as we go through the lecture. Does nuclear meet these basic requirements for new energy? Okay. Sorry, I'm just having trouble. There we go. And just although I'm going to focus particularly on UK nuclear this evening, it's just worth looking at the global picture and just noting actually that nuclear is a very, very small part of our primary fuel consumption across the world. And so if anybody is under the sort of illusion that nuclear is going to answer the whole global warming crisis, it certainly isn't. There's no way we can scale up. And interesting to note from these figures, which are from the BP Statistical Review, that actually nuclear has been going down across the globe over the last few years. In fact, the UK is quite unusual in being one of the few countries that is really aggressively pursuing nuclear. Okay, so let's get right back to the basics of what nuclear power is. And it's worth noting that, of course, when we first started developing it, it wasn't because we wanted electricity, it's because we wanted weapons. This was post Second World War. We wanted the plutonium for our nuclear bombs. And for that, we needed plutonium. And although you can find some plutonium scattered around the Earth in very low quantities after Big Bang, the most reliable way to get usable quantities is through fission, through splitting other materials. And we had a choice of two minerals to split. One is thorium, and thorium had certainly many advantages, more abundant than uranium, the one that we actually went with, and handles well in a reactor and so on. But one of the key differences was that it actually maximizes the destruction of plutonium. And of course, it was plutonium that we wanted. So we didn't go for thorium. It's interesting in that there is now a resurgence of interest in thorium, and the nuclear industry is coming back to look at this as another possible element that could be used. But we did go with uranium. Now, uranium is most of it, more than 90% of it, is not splittable, and that's what we needed to do to release that plutonium that we wanted. It's only about 0.7%, in fact, that is actually splittable, and that's why we have to, when we use uranium, enrich it. We have to pump up that level of splittable atoms in there so that it's actually commercially viable. And you will have heard that term enrichment. So that's kind of what that means. And just to give you the real basics of what nuclear power is and how we get that plutonium, it's this is a very, very simple diagram, but basically you split the first atom and roughly it goes into three parts. One part goes off and does become plutonium. One goes on to continue the chain reaction and goes on to split more further atoms, and the other one is lost. So that's a kind of very, very simplistic diagram of what happens. And this is what happens in a nuclear power station. Basically, those reactions are happening in these cores here, which reach extreme temperatures because of the splitting of those atoms. And we use these rods, we descend these, we lower them over the reaction. These are graphite rods. When we want to slow down the reaction, when we want to speed up the reaction, we lift them up again. And one way or another, we create extreme heat. And in the UK, nuclear power plants, what we do is pass gas around this heat to pick up that heat, and the gas is siphoned off, and then there's a heat exchange with water. The water then comes out as steam, it's extremely hot, and goes off to turn turbines, which then generate electricity. So that's a kind of very simple example. Of course, the nuclear power plants that we're looking at coming in with the next generation actually use the water actually does mix with the radioactive process. And so at the moment in this diagram, the water comes off without any radiation contamination, but actually that's not the case in advanced boiling water reactors. So, and worth just noting there, as I put at the top, like all thermal plants, like our gas plants, coal plants, and so on, these are incredibly inefficient. This means that of the energy put in, only about 38 to 40% of the energy comes out as usable energy. The rest is dumped as heat, okay, hot water or hot air. And so it's an incredibly wasteful process that is also extremely harmful to the environment, of course. So here's a picture, a top-down picture of Oldbury, just one of our nuclear power plants. And you can just see the proximity there of the reactors and the turbines. So the steam is taken over from the reactors over to the turbine hall, where that's where the electricity is generated. So you can see how close they are. And this is the Queen opening our first nuclear power plant, actually in 1956 at Calder Hall. And if anybody's been to visit a nuclear plant, you'll recognise the sort of general format. So, okay, to look at whether nuclear is low carbon, cost effective, secure, safe, all those things that we need to look at. We need to look at the full life cycle analysis of how we turn uranium into energy. And well, okay, so we have to start with where do we get our uranium from? And just, it's a fun fact that we do have one uranium mine in this country. It's down in Cornwall. It was used by Mary Stopes, or it provided her with her supplies, but of course it's now defunct. It's interesting, if you go on YouTube, you can find film of people driving around this area with Geiger counters, and actually the Geiger counters going fairly berserk. So it's certainly, there's quite a high level of radiation around that mine. But so if we're not using uranium from our own country, where are we getting it? Well, this is the list from the World Nuclear Association. And you can see, you may look at that and think, well, that's pretty encouraging. There's lots of friendly countries up there at the top: Australia, Kazakhstan, Canada, South Africa, and so on. So that all looks nice and secure for us. The thing is that actually the real issue isn't so much who's got the most uranium, it's what density the ore is. Because you will see here that Canada, that actually has the highest density of ore, is at absolute most 20%. And actually the bottom table on the right-hand side, you'll see what their different mines are producing at the moment. And most of those are still absolutely nowhere near 20%. So when we say what we're talking about there, is what it means is that you have to, for every ton of rock, of ore that you mine, 80% has to be thrown away to get that 20% of usable uranium. Now, as you look down the list, the extraordinary thing is that quite a high percentage of the world's uranium actually comes from a country like Namibia, where we're operating at an unbelievable 100 parts per million. That's 0.01%. We throw away 99.9% of the ore in order to get that uranium. So we are already mining ore at an incredibly low density. And of course, that has huge implications for the power that's used for that, all the processes that are involved in that, and therefore for the affordability and the carbon content and so on. Okay, so how do we get uranium out of the ground? Well, we can do it through open cast mining, as this one, the Rersing mine in Namibia, needs a huge amount of water, of course, to dampen down the radon gas and so on. And there's a lot of reports of and claims for cancer, as cancer victims for people who've worked here. But of course, these are Africans and we've never really cared much about those. So that's how it is. What we do in North America, and both these shots are from North America, is either heap leaching, and you'll see this is heap leaching on the right, where you just pile up the ore on very robust plastic maps, and then you drench it with acid for about 3 months. That gantry will be moving up and down, drenching the ore with acid so that the uranium will separate and come out. So that's one way of doing it. Or the other way of doing it is to, as here, is in situ leaching, and you push the acid down through the water table into the ore-bearing rock, and you turn that ore-bearing rock into a sludge, and then you just pump it out again, and then leave the gas to evaporate, and then you take the uranium that you need. And certainly, I mean, I've been in groups where we've heard from, you know, the indigenous people in northern Canada, for example. This is a bit like fracking. This is an extremely environmentally disastrous way of doing things. Water is contaminated, and so on. It has a huge impact, but we don't often hear about this. So we then take that ore and we roast it at about 8,000 degrees, I think, in a roasting machine, a calciner, until it's dry and crushed, and we turn it into uranium yellow cake. In fact, these days, yellow cake tends to look more brown or black, but this is what it was originally called, yellow cake. And that's a fairly inert substance, and we move that around the world. We don't, we use special ships, but we can transport it in ordinary containers. And in fact, the World Nuclear Association would say there've never been any accidents with these ships. And in fact, they don't quite like the level of surveillance and the accompanying ships that they have to take with them. So when that ship comes to the UK, when it's to supply our nuclear power plants, it comes into Ellesmere Port near Liverpool, and it will then move down. So that's where it's actually imported, and then it'll be transported overland here down to Caithness. And at Caithness, that's where it's enriched. So as I said at the beginning, we need to pump up the level of fissile material within that uranium. And it's very difficult to find out much information about what exactly happens at Caithness. But again, in terms of answering the questions that we've set ourselves, I just think you should note, the high level of energy infrastructure around this plant. Obviously, this is a high consumption area. And so how do we do that enrichment? There are two ways of doing it. You can do it with centrifuges and spin out the uranium, and with the molecular weight, you can then isolate the bits you want and pump it up into the uranium, into the fissile material. Or you can do it through gaseous diffusion, which is much heavier in terms of energy consumption, about 60 times as much energy required in that. So again, energy intensive processes just to get this going. Just to say, there are other things happening at Caithness. I won't dwell on these, but obviously it's a store for our highly enriched uranium that we used to use on our weapons. We now just take plutonium from Sellafield to tip our weapons. It's also a site of store for our depleted uranium. Yes, so various things going on there, but just so you know. We then take the enriched uranium from Caithness up to Springfields, where it's turned into fuel rods. And from there, it's shipped out across the country to the different nuclear power plants. And again, graphite is produced there at 3,000 degrees and so on. So these are very energy intensive processes. And of course, up until very recently, the end of last year, what was a particular worry is that these trucks were using the same little back roads as the trucks from Quadrilla and so on. So that was a particular worry. Okay, but at some point, what we realized was that if we were going to all this trouble in order to find plutonium for our weapons, which was the main point, we might as well produce electricity from the processes. It was, you know, as a friend described it to me, who knows the business very well, it was a sort of elegant solution. Why not produce electricity from it as well? So there we are. We opened our first nuclear power plant in 1956. There's the Queen again. This was at Calder Hall. And we went on, you know, what we were promised was electricity that would be too cheap to meter. And in fact, even Tony Benn, who was Energy Secretary during the 60s, was convinced. He did go on and say it was one of the biggest mistakes he'd ever made in his life. But even he was convinced at the time. And we certainly embraced nuclear power big time. And what we went on to build were our 26 Magnox reactors. And these are the names that you're probably very familiar with: Dungeness, Hinkley, Oldbury, Chapel Cross, and so on. And this first generation of nuclear power plants are all closed. The last one, Wilfer 2, on the Isle of Anglesey closed at the end of December. So these are now all shut down. And what happens when we shut them down? You can see on this chart here, they generate for this for a period. They are then defueled, and all these Magnox plants will now be defueled. They are then, most of them now in, or they're all in fact in a system of what we call care and maintenance preparations. Now that means we've got to lock them down. There's a lot of radioactive or potentially radioactive and toxic stuff on site that can't be moved off site. It's buildings, it's pipe work and so on. And so this has got to be made safe. So that's the care and maintenance preparations. We then once all that is concluded, we leave those sites for 100 years. We just leave them alone, walk away. And then we will come back for the final site clearance. So just worth noting that when we had DEC, I mean, one of the issues again is about how much this costs. Just this alone was costing 65% of the DEC budget. Of course, DEC has now been subsumed into BASE, the business department. But again, this is a heavy load on our state in terms of just managing what we have got. And this is just the Magnox plants. And I just put this one up because back in 2016, I actually visited one of our nuclear power plants, Trawsfynydd, and it's our only inland plant. It's on a reservoir in just south of Snowdonia, and I'd highly recommend a visit if you're passing that way. And this plant closed in 1993. So this is 23 years on that I went to visit. And this is the state it was in. This is what was happening. This was a photograph I took. You can see that the site is absolutely alive. There were people working all over this site. The car park was full. It was extremely busy. And what they're doing is getting it into this, but that's the aim, that little picture at the bottom. So locking down those buildings. What really struck me, and I've never had an answer to this, so if anybody out there works for the nuclear industry and would like to answer me, what this is in the middle of nowhere, apart from a tiny little cafe for the fishermen in the area. But when I stepped out of my car, the air was absolutely throbbing with electricity. I assume diesel generators. It was absolutely, you know, you could feel it, you could hear it. It was incredibly loud. And I guess I honestly can't tell why exactly, but it was certainly to do with the work going on at the nuclear power plant. And I guess I'm just making that point, is that when we look at the full life cycle analysis of anything, but including nuclear, we have to really work out where do you draw the line of that cost analysis and the carbon emissions, because 23 years on, for us to be consuming that much energy in just managing this site is something that really should be included, and I'm not convinced that it is. So our Magnox all closed in 2015, but during the 60s, we got going with our second generation of nuclear power plants, our advanced gas-cooled reactors. And these are the ones that are operating now in our country. So this was an attempt to improve on the Magnox design. It was a British design. We hoped that we were going to export this design around the world. In fact, we didn't. None were exported. And in fact, they were a bit of a disaster in many ways. They were extremely late, extremely over budget generally, and you know, weren't a huge success, except that they have, of course, produced a lot of electricity for us over the last few decades. And this is where we are with these. You can see there's Wilford, the last one that was supposed to close in 2012, actually closed in 2015. They're the Magnox. And then below that, these are our 7 sites. These are all twin reactors, so 2 reactors on each site. And we've got one more reactor, which is the one at Sizewell, which is an outlier. It's an American design, a pressurized water reactor. But these are our AGRs. Now you can see on the dates there, oops, let's have a look, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 of these should all be closed by now. Okay, but they're not closed. And that is because they've all been given 10-year life extensions. So this is the position we're in now. So whatever we want to say is that in terms of the future for these, some of them absolutely need to come offline by these dates because they've already been extended. So 2023, 2023, 24, 24. So we've got a lot coming off in the next few years. And the question is, you know, how well prepared are we in the UK to accommodate that loss of power generation? actually, one thing is that, as you can see on the bottom line there, most of these are operating at well below capacity at the moment, and there are various reasons for that. In fact, actually, when I looked on Saturday on the EDF website, 7 of those reactors are not operating at the moment. And this is at our crunch part of the year. This is February, when we need all generation to be available to us, but 7 of our nuclear reactors are not operating. And that is partly because they are suffering quite a bit of weakening and cracking. There are some serious issues about how safe some of them are. We've had some emergency shutdowns at Hunterston and Dungeness and Heysham. So I would really recommend, if you want to understand this better, and it actually is quite frightening, I have to say, is listening to Radio 4's Costing the Earth Nuclear Futures, which came out a few years ago, but where they actually did various freedom of information requests to find out the extent of the cracking and the graphite loss in our nuclear power plants. Obviously, the point is that this is being carefully surveyed. Hunterston has been off for much of the last 18 months or so. It was allowed back on for 4 months and it's come off again. We have to rely on our nuclear authorities to be watching this, but it is certainly true that our nuclear is not contributing anywhere near what we think it should be at the moment, or what its full capacity would indicate it should. I think the other thing to note, and it's just becoming an increasing risk to us, is that we've actually had some emergency shutdowns of our nuclear because of extreme weather, and actually other countries even more so. Generally, we've just about got away with it, but in the summer of 2018, certainly France had to close down a lot of its nuclear power plant. At the moment, we're seeing in Texas in the US, because of the conditions there, literally the gas is freezing, everything is freezing. And if you haven't got enough water, these are very high water consumers. Each reactor would be taking between 1 and 2.5 billion gallons of water per day. And if that is frozen, you can't operate your nuclear power plant. So if it's too hot, or if there's flooding, or it's too cold, just like other forms of thermal power plants, nuclear isn't going to work. So it's not as reliable as it appears. And we certainly have had sudden shutdowns, which have sent our electricity prices sky high. Let's get this to move on. Hang on one second. Right, there we go. So it's worth just looking. I hope you're all familiar with GridWatch. I've just taken this screen grab on the left there from last Saturday, and you can see for Saturday, February, our consumption was fairly moderate at about 32 gigawatts, and you can see nuclear was only about 4.3 gigawatts. That's really not a huge amount, particularly in February. This is, you know, our sort of peak consumption time generally. So it's fairly small, and there's our wind very nicely on the weekend at almost 45%, and our solar and our hydro taking us over to 50%. But and just to make the point that actually it's because of those outages that actually in 2019 our nuclear, the element of our power generation that came from nuclear is down below that 20% that we were talking about at the beginning of the talk, and I would expect 2020 probably to be even less than that. So, okay, in terms of our infrastructure, then we've got our old Magnox, we've got our operating AGRs. There are some research stations and other areas around the country, but there are a few that you will have heard of possibly. Dounreay is one of them. This is where we were doing fast breeder research, looking at whether we could actually operate nuclear power plants from plutonium. And that operated for a long time until there was a massive explosion in 1977. The safety audit was damning. What they found was that they had simply been throwing debris, waste of all sorts, unrecorded, down a shaft, not knowing what was down there until the whole lot exploded. And this is an area now where nobody will be able to use that sea or that coastal area for around another 200 years. It's completely off limits. Radioactive particles all over the place. And we've just started to try and start retrieving some of that waste, sending it to Sellafield, sending some of it to the US. But again, I suppose this is going to come into a theme which I think actually is very, very relevant here, which is about how reckless and irresponsible this industry has been, literally within one generation of setting up, you know, our nuclear research and power production. So there we are. Dounreay is just one. Sellafield, of course, is the other piece of infrastructure which you will certainly have heard about. There on the coast there in Cumbria. So what happens at Sellafield? Well, it was the original site of that first nuclear power plant. It took waste from our Magnox plants and then developed Thorpe, which actually closed down just a couple of years ago to take waste from our AGRs, but also from across the world. We were importing other people's waste with the idea that we could reprocess it into a usable fuel. In fact, it never worked. It lost us money. Within a week of opening Thorpe, we actually closed down our fast breeder program. So it was never profitable for us. But that's history now. We have the legacy, of course, but the main thing that we know it for now is the storage of our high level waste coming from all our nuclear power plants across the country. It is, or has until recently, been going to Sellafield. And how does it get to Sellafield? Well, it goes by train mainly, some road transport. This is taken down in Taunton from Hinkley. So it's transported by road and then put on train. And I believe, I'm told, I've never sat up at night and counted it, but I'm told that there are about 4 trains going through Bristol per week with nuclear fuel of some sort going in either direction. And just so we're absolutely clear when we're talking about nuclear waste and we're talking about the sort of lifespan of which this has to be managed, the most worrying products that come from our nuclear industry are the fission, transuranics and various other fission projects. And you can see that these have a half-life of hundreds of thousands of years or tens of thousands of years up to millions of years. And the half-life is the time that it takes for half the radionuclides to become stable. And during that period, as they decay, they put out radiation that is harmful, ionizing radiation, which can harm our cells. So we're talking about very long time periods here. And in fact, the time frame for high level waste management is anything really between about 100,000 years and 1 million years. So that is what we are producing at the moment, and we have around 500,000 cubic meters of it. We expect to have about 750 within the foreseeable future. And globally, I guess to put it in more down to earth terms, we're adding about 100 double-decker buses of nuclear waste per year onto the world's load. And while it remains above ground, of course, there is that risk of proliferation, the risk, and it does go missing, and we don't always know where it's gone. So there are various safety risks to add into that mix. So, but what have we been doing with that waste over the years since we started up our nuclear power program? Well, it's not a great history. We've dumped an awful lot of it at sea. The Atlantic and the Pacific are full of barrels of nuclear waste that not just we, the UK, but other countries have dumped into the sea. What I find extraordinary, and I'd love someone to tell me that this isn't true, but we actually banned dumping at sea in 1993. But on that bottom middle side here, what we have at Sellafield is a pipe going from the nuclear power plant out into the Irish Sea. And because we dump the waste in Sellafield, we can apparently, from what I read, say that we are not dumping it at sea. The fact that the pipe ends up in the sea seems to not count, which seems kind of extraordinary to me. But Sellafield generally is a mess, and even the government, if you look on the government website, that I put the link to it there at the bottom on the right, that blue bit there, it's worth reading. The government now says the bill for cleaning up Sellafield is around 97 billion, but the government admits that it is unknowable. We do not know how much this is going to cost. There's a really interesting panorama that came out just about 3 or 4 years ago, and you can probably still get it on iPlayer. And it was absolutely damning. What they found was that the staff levels were routinely too low, that there were umpteen incidents that were ignored or not recorded properly, that the alarms went off sometimes up to 1,000 times a day, so routinely that nobody even investigated what the alarms were about. Radioactive materials being stored in plastic bottles, and the big one that you've probably heard about are the corroding ponds. Now this is where this very, very hot waste has to be stored and actively cooled. That water has to be recycled all the time to keep that that material cool, and that has to go on for decades until it's possible to handle it. But what the government itself says is that Sellafield was hastily built. It's had poor record keeping, it's densely packed, and basically it needs groundbreaking technologies, i.e. we don't have the wherewithal at the moment to manage this. That is the position we're in with Sellafield. It's not a good position. And of course, as I say, the high level waste is going to Sellafield. The intermediate level waste is staying on site, the buildings and the infrastructure that can't be moved off site. But the low level waste, the lab equipment, the building materials and so on, that's actually the high volume stuff. Much, much bigger, as you can see, than the others. And so what do we do with that? Well, that's been going to a village called Drigg in Cumbria. Poor Cumbria seems to get it all. And for a long time, what we were doing was just tipping it into trenches and sticking a load of cement on top. We now have been putting it since the 80s into metal containers and cementing it with grout. But we have many reports of corrosion, cracking, leaking, and certainly a 2014 report said this site, we should never have chosen a site so close to the sea. And it is inevitable that there is going to be radioactive leakage. There is radioactive leakage from this into the ocean, into the North Sea, also the Irish Sea. So the bit of infrastructure that you won't hear about, of course, is the bit that we need, which is a Geological Disposal Facility, a GDF. And this is, I think everybody can agree, we've got what we've got. We can't do much, we can't put that back, and we need somewhere safe to store it. And it's not safe to store it above ground. I think everybody has a consensus on that. So we need to find some place underground where we can lock it away and know that the geology is safe for the time period that we're looking at, and you know, there's not going to be any repercussions from doing this. Now, every country is struggling to put together a GDF. I think Finland has gone the furthest towards this. The other one that actually has, the only one that has actually been built is in New Mexico, and that almost immediately had some quite major problems with a drum bursting, problems with the underground transport and so on. And the problem with the GDF is that basically once the stuff is down there and it's all sealed, there's nothing that we can do about it. If anything goes wrong at that point, there's nothing we can do. We can only just stand back and cope with what happens. And interestingly, the New Mexico one, they're just relying on the salt layers for over the many centuries to come to actually collapse and deform and sort of produce a seal over this. But as I say, we in the UK haven't got anywhere near to starting to build a GDF. We keep hoping internationally, the international community keeps hoping that Australia is going to come to the rescue, and if we give them enough money, they'll dig a big hole in the outback and take all our waste fuel. But pesky environmentalists in Australia keep putting their hands up and saying that's not a good idea, which I guess we can understand. So it's interesting, the UK has, we've got these wonderful plans, and I love this quote: a GDF will be designed using natural geology and engineering so that the waste is contained inside these multiple barriers to provide protection over hundreds of thousands of years. We've got all the designs, we've got the statement, but we just don't have the GDF. And what's clear is that we don't have the geology in this country. Cumbria's geology is most definitely not good enough for the job. It will not keep this material safe for the period that we need it to. There were some looks over at Thetford, I think, Thetford Forest, but basically the geology in the UK is incredibly complex and dense and changeable, and we do not have the right geology for storing this. But that hasn't deterred our government. We do have a problem, so we have to find it, and certainly at the moment they are on a mission to persuade, they've been on a mission to persuade for the last few years, different local authorities to accept a GDF on the basis that they will get some extra financial support, just a few million, in fact, to help keep council tax down. And certainly at the moment, I think this is quite worrying, since we know that Cumbria has got the wrong geology. The government is very much focused on getting a GDF into Cumbria because it's about the only county that it's likely to accept a GDF, only because they have a history, of course, of Sellafield and Drigg and so on. So they have a long association with nuclear, and the government is hoping that that will be enough to persuade local communities to host this GDF. In the meantime, what are we doing with that waste? Because it's certainly mounting up, and it's going to take many, many years, even if we persuade communities to accept a GDF. It's going to take many years to build that. At the moment, things like, I mean, who knew? Hinkley Point C, which is obviously currently under construction, has asked for a non-material change, and I believe that's now been accepted. And in fact, several of our nuclear power plants are keeping their high-level waste on site themselves at the moment, but an awful lot of it is being shipped to Hinkley for storage as well. I don't remember being asked about this, but maybe you do. Okay, almost at the end here, and then I'm very, very happy to answer some questions. And obviously I'll continue on Wednesday night looking more at the UK policy. But I think one of the issues here is, you know, nuclear waste is something we have to consider very, very seriously. And it is very clear, one of the big issues here is when we do find somewhere to bury it, if we find somewhere to bury it, how are we going to communicate with future generations? And it's interesting, there was an unbelievable program on Radio 4 just a couple of years ago called Radioactive Art. And the nuclear industry has been throwing money at various artists and such like, to craftspeople, to find ways that they might be able to communicate with future generations. And it was actually really surreal. They've been looking at jewelry and you know, because of course we've still got stuff left over from the Greeks and the Romans and so on. You know, this stuff can last, but is it going to warn us about extreme danger? Unlikely. I think I put a picture of Stonehenge up there because Keith Barnum, who's head of physics at, or was head of physics at Imperial College, in his book The Burning Question, he asks this very relevant point, which is, Stonehenge was built about 4,000 years ago. We have no idea what they were trying to do or what they were trying to communicate with us. And similarly, we will have no way of communicating with future generations, you know, thousands of years down the line, to tell them what we want to happen with these particular sites. So we really do have a major problem here. Anyway, okay, so I hope that's a sort of rattle through kind of what nuclear power is and what the infrastructure is that we have in this country. And I'm very, very happy to answer questions now, but we'll go on Wednesday to answer some really crucial points about UK energy policy and Hinkley, and really wrap up that question about, is nuclear something that we need now to get us through our energy crisis?
Has there been any investment in developing nuclear fission, or is that out of the question because the government wants uranium for weapons?
Okay, so nuclear fission is what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing. I think what you're probably asking about is nuclear fusion. And that's a completely different process. And I will be discussing that on Wednesday. That's actually quite different. That's rather than splitting material, it's actually about bringing it together. The sun, of course, is our biggest it's our biggest sort of fusion reactor, and that's what we're trying to replicate on Earth. And yes, our government is, I think this is very much a reaction to Brexit, is now saying that we are going to try and develop a fusion research centre in the UK, and it's out to tender with various communities interested, or mainly it's nuclear sites where we've got, or existing nuclear facilities are bidding to host a nuclear fusion research centre. Yeah.
Rose asks, is there no use at all for all this waste?
Uh, well, it seems not. We've been doing this since the 1950s and we haven't found a use for it. The only possible use was to turn it into a usable fuel. And that's what Thorpe was about. We tried to do that. But in fact, and the only power plant in the UK which could potentially have used that fuel was Sizewell. And it didn't, because it was cheaper to buy new fuel, virgin fuel, on the market. So it was never cost effective. No, we haven't found a use for it. Unfortunately.
Just a very simple one. What does DEC mean?
Oh, DEC. That must be from a younger member of our audience. Up until a few years ago, it was the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So it was a government department that was set up under the last Labour government, specifically to look at energy and climate change. When, I can't remember when it would be around 2013, 14, the Conservative government decided to set up BASE, which is the Business, Energy and Industry Department, and they took DEC into them. So it's become part of a business orientated government department now.
How does this volume of waste compare to other fuels such as coal slag heaps?
I don't know. I don't have an absolute comparison with that. I guess in terms of volume, if you're asking that, possibly. I couldn't tell you that much about coal slag heaps and coal waste in this country. It's probably quite sizable. The point is that it's fairly inert. It is true that waste coal and coal mines put out quite a bit of methane, which is certainly dangerous and certainly something we need to consider with climate change, of course, but it isn't toxic, explosive and radioactive in the way that nuclear waste is. It doesn't need that high level management in the way that nuclear does.
How well protected is Hinkley Point C from sea level rise and storms?
Okay, I mean, it's something I'm going to address on Wednesday, but I think when we look at climate change, I've talked about extreme weather, but the other huge risk, and it's amazing how this just isn't being discussed at all, because almost all our nuclear power plants are around our coast because of their water requirements. The only one that isn't is Trawsfynydd, which I mentioned. And yes, we are looking at a metre sea level rise by the end of this century, possibly more, 1.2. That's pretty much baked in. I mean, I was shocked when I heard Sir David King, the government's science advisor, at the end of one of Mark Carney's Wreath lectures this year. I think it's the first time I've very clearly heard one of our eminent scientists saying that this tipping point has been crossed and this is baked in. The level of sea level rise we have coming down the pipeline is not something we can avoid now. We need to plan for at least a metre's sea level rise by the end of the century, and probably more, in fact. So yes, that really affects our nuclear power plants. I actually was sat in on a lecture. I managed to sneak in through a friend. It was the Learned Fellows of Nuclear Science or something like that. It was a very weird professional group of nuclear scientists, and they were discussing the Bradwell nuclear power plant and the designs for that. So we sat through about an hour and a half listening to the technicalities of the safety specifications for Bradwell. That's what the focus was about. And at the end, I felt a bit of an idiot, but I put up my hand very tentatively and I said, look, I'm not from the nuclear industry, but how are you planning for sea level rise? And there was this enormous shockwave went across the room, because I think maybe it was the naivety of my question, but nobody could answer it. The speakers who were delivering the lecture on the safety of our next nuclear power plant couldn't answer this question. And eventually it was a civil servant who was sitting behind me who said, well, I don't know about Bradwell, but I think Sizewell, we're planning to lift the structure by about a metre. You know, I mean, I don't know. I just get the impression this industry is very insular. It's very powerful. It has very powerful lobbying. And I don't get the impression that they are thinking forward for climate change and for all the risks that there will be to our nuclear power plants, their functioning and their safety. That's the impression I get, but I'd love to hear something different from somebody within the industry. I've had people from the nuclear industry come to my talks, and actually what I usually get are emails afterwards saying you were spot on, and actually these are some extra facts you should know. So yeah, so yeah, I'm afraid
you usually
I'm not
get a
hopeful.
lot of people telling you, yes, but there has to be a mixture.
Yeah, well, that is the old thing. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
One of the questions here is, did you really mean Mary Stopes?
Marie Stopes. No, not Marie Stopes. Marie Curie. Sorry. Duh, yes, you're right. Marie Curie, of course, who did the research. Yes.
Because radioactive waste is so hot, can the heat not be used in some form of energy?
Well, there's an interesting thought. Again, it hasn't been so far. Could it be used? Yes. I think the economics of nuclear are so utterly weird. This is not an industry that has to justify its take of the financial budget of the government's budget, or our budget, our taxpayers' budget. And I don't think it's ever been on their mind to be particularly efficient with their resources. It seems to me.
A question about Wednesday's talk. Will you be covering comparative electricity costs of nuclear versus renewables, etc., both set up and ongoing to the consumer?
I can certainly point you in that direction on Wednesday. Yes. Yes.
A comment about slag heaps. There are over 100 slag heaps just in Caithness. Heavy rain is making some less safe.
All right.
Okay. And one more question. There was an article in the press recently saying research is going into creating batteries using nuclear isotopes, which would last forever. Can you comment?
No, I mean, I've heard there's so much research going on, such a wide variety of fields. I'm not qualified to speak directly to that. I have heard this idea that, yes, we're going to have perpetual batteries from nuclear. I don't know until I see the facts and have it explained in greater detail. No, I don't know enough about that.
Okay. And the last question is from Libby. She simply asks, how do you stay so positive?
Bless you, Libby. How do I stay so positive? It's a good question. I think I don't quite a lot of the time. I think if any of you came to my talk last week about whether we're going to ensure a green recovery or whether we're losing the chance for a green recovery, I mean, I was very tempted to put up a slide, basically asking, is it time to put out the deck chairs and pour ourselves the gin and tonics, and as per the deck of the Titanic. And sometimes it certainly feels that way to me now, that we are so close. I was reading yesterday, the IPCC say we could reach 1.5 degrees by as early as 2026. That's 5 years away. That's 5 years away. This is disastrous. But it gave a span, and that was the earliest date. Obviously, it's possible that we put this off for much longer. I think at the rate we're going, it's quite clear we are going to go over 1.5 degrees. Why? And I tell you what keeps me going is that we have beaten so many of the models so far. We never thought we would be in this position with our energy mix, with the current costs of wind and solar and batteries and so on. If you'd asked me or anybody else, an energy watcher 5 or 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought we would be at this position. We have moved much, much faster than anyone expected, than any of the models predicted. And my only hope is that we get it now. We stop wondering who's going to take a lead on it and understand that we all have to take a lead on it. And we all move. So I can only keep hoping, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
A couple more have now come in. Are there any advantages for the proposed mini reactors?
Oh, SMRs. Okay, again, we'll talk about SMRs on Wednesday, small modular reactors. And my answer to that is no, just so that people understand what a small modular reactor is. They don't exist at the moment, but the idea is that we bring down the costs of nuclear partly by having kind of flat pack nuclear. So it's largely manufactured off-site, and we produce very small nuclear power plants. I don't know, Bristol might have 3 around it, for example, a typical city, producing, you know, a few 100 megawatt each. And that's the idea. The costs actually, and we will discuss this on Wednesday, the costs just don't make that viable. You know, Rolls-Royce are the lead on this, and it's still just a few hundred megawatts of a nuclear power plant will cost several billions to produce. And I haven't seen anyone explain about how we get the fuel in and out of small modular reactors safely. You know, when they are really dotted all around the country, just not just in specific, you know, large thermal plants along our coast, but actually dotted all around the country, all around our cities and so on. To me, that sounds a bit of a logistical nightmare. It doesn't get around the problem of what we do with our nuclear waste. We'll just be generating more of it. And that doesn't seem either a good solution on many fronts, environmentally, cost-wise, energy-wise, anything. So no, to me, it seems like a red herring. To me, frankly, it looks like the government giving another bung to Rolls-Royce, a failing company. So.
Do you rate the proposals for factory-made small plants as in nuclear subs?
Factory-based small plants are, as I've discussed, SMRs. Yes, the idea that since we've been able to put them on nuclear submarines, that they are then going to be usable on land. Well, as I discussed, the question is, are we going to put them all over the place around our cities and so on? And for many reasons that I've explained, I don't think that's a good idea.
I think just one more, basically. Are there any plans to develop thorium reactors, or have they ruled these out because they don't provide material for weapons?
Yeah, well, thorium is certainly being looked at very seriously now. In fact, in Norway at Haldane, they've got a big thorium research centre. India is very interested in thorium because they've got big thorium reserves. So no, there are certainly lots of enthusiasts for going back to thorium, for finding another source other than uranium, which will be more abundant and therefore less difficult to source, and so on. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. But just remember, every time to design a nuclear reactor and to get through the specification process, as we can see with Bradwell and Sizewell at the moment, it takes close to 10 years to get approval in a country. So, you know, we don't even have the reactors designed for thorium. As far as I understand, they would need to be different to the uranium ones we have. And they would need to go through that. Every country, whichever country they were going into, they would have to go through their approval process, which is lengthy. Now, when we are talking about the timescales that we are with climate change and the need for clean sources of fuel now, it just doesn't make sense to me. Why would we go down the route of developing this? This is going to be, it's very clear, much, much more expensive than the renewables we have. We've already got very cheap renewables and the costs still coming down. Why would we go there? I just don't understand why we would, except that of course, weapons have been the main impetus behind the development of our uranium reactors.
Okay, I think we're going to make this the last nuclear question. Will the latest Hinkley point actually work?
Will it work? Will it happen? Well, again, we'll talk about that on Wednesday. You will know that Hinkley has been beset with multiple problems, and now I think Flamanville, which it's based on in France, has put back its opening date till 2024. It was supposed to be 2012. We were, of course, supposed to be cooking our dinners, our Christmas dinners, in 2017 on electricity from Hinkley, and we are nowhere near to completing Hinkley. They've just pushed back again their start date till the late 2020s, and the costs have just gone up again to now, I think, about 23 billion. So it is... will Hinkley actually go ahead? I mean, we have been racing to put, or shall I say, the government and EDF have been racing to build Hinkley as quickly as they can, so that it couldn't be reversed. we contractually, we could still just walk away. The UK could walk away because the contract over Hinkley is very much based on Flamanville being up and running, and Flamanville is not up and running. We have the right to walk away from this. It was our previous Chancellor Hammond who said, why aren't we walking away? It's because basically we don't want to piss off the French and the Chinese, particularly the Chinese. So it's a political thing. Yeah, and it's again to do with our weapons and so on, but we'll discuss more about that on Wednesday.
Okay, so the last thing was Pam wanted to know where the rest of your talk, whether there are videos of the rest of your talks. The answer is yes, some of them are still available online, but they're a little bit scattered around. Some of them on the Avon Needs Trees YouTube channel. Some of them are on the BCR Energy Group YouTube channel. I'll post a link to the BCR one in the chat. But basically, if you go on YouTube and search for Nikki Jones, spelt with 2 Ks and an I, you should come up with a lot of Nikki's old talks. But yeah, unfortunately, there isn't sort of, since she doesn't have a website at the moment. We don't have
I got
one
rid of my
place for
website.
them.
The other place to look on them is for the Bristol NG Cooperative. They actually sponsored some of my talks back in 2016 or so, so they're a little bit out of date, but not that out of date. And these new ones will be put on their website as well.
Nikki for president.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.